brought to you by Striker Hexo.ai.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Indian Express. Today we're fortunate, very fortunate once again to have Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta with us. He of course writes regularly for the Indian Express. He's one of our leading columnists. We spoke to him before the election in the US and now we're speaking to him after. Welcome sir once again.
Thank you, as always, great privilege.
One of the first big question now, it's very clear that Mr. Trump has won. It's been declared popular vote, both houses of the American legislature and of course the presidency, with margins that weren't expected by most people. It is a landslide victory by American standards, as most people are calling it. So the first question is, in 2016, when Mr. Trump was first elected, that was the beginning of the conversation of this sort of democratic backsliding. Of after post-elections, it was happening, and Brexit had just happened, and there was Mr. Trump's election, there was a whole, and then European countries to some extent, some other emerging countries as well. What do you think will happen now in his second term, and do you see that trend deepening? Is it an exaggeration? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so look, one of the things we have to be very clear about is that he has a popular mandate, right? This is really quite an extraordinary electoral victory by any standards. And when we speak of democratic backsliding, we have something very specific in mind. It's not denying that he has popular legitimation, right? I think it's important to say that because, right? Now, Gary Kasparov once said something quite interesting. He said, when you look at would-be authoritarians, they often lie about what they did in the past, but they often tell you the truth about what they're going to do in the future. So first, let us just look at what Donald Trump has himself said, or at least indicated might happen in a second term, right? And what bearing does this have on democratic life? First of all, he has warned of retribution against political opponents. I think his argument would be that he was targeted by incumbent regimes, and that therefore there's nothing actually new about this. But the possibility that the targeting of political business opponents, inconvenient actors in civil society, increases considerably. I think that possibility certainly grows. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the mechanisms for doing it will not be, in a sense, outright repression, as used to be the case with traditional authoritarians. It's actually using established legal processes, right? Administrative law, tax law, Justice Department inquiries, to actually produce outcomes that significantly impact Europe's, that deter other people's independence and so forth. So I think that's one thing he has promised, right, in some senses. And if that were to come through, I think it would be a big threat to democracy. The second is Trump, too, comes with the great advantage that he practically controls all branches of government. The Supreme Court ideologically leans towards his position. He will control, the Republicans control the Senate and most likely may end up controlling the House. And what that means is that his ability to get through appointments, right, grows up considerably. The usual checks and balances of divided government that have marked the US for large parts of its history, those usual checks and balances are weakened. That has to be read in the context of some recent Supreme Court rulings, right, which have already prepared the groundwork for him being able to exercise far greater latitude in the exercise of power than probably any modern American president, right, at least in recent memory. And one particular ruling, which was in this famous Chevron case, which basically where the Supreme Court said that essentially established agencies had no power of rule making without, in some senses, going through Congress. Now, what that effectively means is that actually large chunks of the regulatory state can be actually gutted quite easily under the cover of that Supreme Court doctrine. Now, some of that consideration of deregulation might be actually helpful. I think there is a case to be made that the American state needs to be rationalized in some respects. But on the other hand, it also actually gives the state, in a sense, kind of enormous power to frankly restructure the entire regulatory kind of system in a sense in American society. There's another thing which is in a sense on the agenda, particularly in light of the recent campus protests, let's say on the Israel-Palestine issue. You have now laws in the books that actually make it much more difficult to criticize Israel. You have potential Trump administration officials, or at least people in a sense that are considered part of the ecosystem, essentially indicating, right, that they might actually go after or initiate some kinds of proceedings against students who participated in these protests. That will have a dampening effect on civil society. And Trump's biggest issue, which is immigration. Now, Trump has a point that no society with a straight face can collapse the distinction between legal and illegal immigration, right? But given the vast numbers of undocumented immigrants in the United States, even the bare demand to prove documentation could actually prove quite frightening and exclusionary for large numbers of innocent people who have been in America for actually quite a while. I mean, there's an analogy within India, right? Exactly. The NRC and the CEA process, right? So all said and done, in a sense, right? If you in a sense put this package together, we're not quite sure what he'll do on reproductive rights for women, but if you put this package together, you have all the kind of elements emerging of something closer to what scholars call autocratic legalism, in ways that I think the United States has not seen for a while.
Yeah. So, the other thing that since 2016, and we heard it in fact through the Biden years as well, and Trump was a part of that in America, but other parts of the world, is polarization. It's become almost a buzzword now in society as much as in politics, or in society as a result of politics. He now has an electoral, huge mandate. But do you see, given these kinds of things that he may well do or has promised to do, do you see any space for him reaching out or healing, or is that middle space now almost completely gone in American politics?
No, so, as we discussed, right, before this election, in the program before this election, I think we have to be a little bit more specific about the dimensions on which we are talking of polarization, right? Polarization between whom, right? And I think in this election, right, I think a couple of interesting things are emerging. So first of all credit to Trump. He has created a very wide-ranging social coalition, at least in racial terms, right? There's just no question about it. And to that extent, right, racial polarization in a conventional sense is not something that is probably straightforwardly on the cards right now, right? Because when we think of polarization, that's what normally people think. In the first term, that's what people thought of, right? Kind of white supremacy versus something else. I think it's fair to say that is not going to be the major axis of polarization in some ways, right? The second axis of polarization, which is really, I think, at the heart of the economics of Trump's mandate, is one simplistic way, slightly simple way of describing what happened in this election, is that Trump has created an interesting coalition of the extremes in economic terms, which is there is a section of the industrial class, right, entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who are quite creative, dynamic, who actually produce things. There's an alliance of that class with large sections of the working class, right, who had felt excluded by previous democratic liberal administrations. This coalition, in a sense, is pitting itself against a educated, college-educated, professional class, right? So if you look at some of the exit poll data, right, actually a lot of rich people have voted for the Democrats, right, particularly with incomes above, $150,000, right? And I think this creates a very interesting class polarization dynamic, right? Where you actually have this alliance of the kind of entrepreneurs at the top with the working class base actually pitting itself against a kind of professional educated class. And this professional educated class, right, and is also considered to be the source of big kind of ideological discomfiture in US politics, which is this class is now considered with creating almost new forms of identity politics. What they call wokeism in some ways, right? Yeah. So this class politics is kind of overlaid with this kind of cultural identity politics. And that is, in a sense, certainly going to, I think, sharpen in some ways. What is also going to sharpen, I think, the polarization is that the institutions associated with this class, right? Mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, universities in particular, right? The institutions that are associated with this class are going to come under greater attack. And as a kind of counter mobilization, you will get this kind of fear, paranoia of deepening authoritarianism. So the axis is going to be, in some senses, like in India, more around authoritarianism directed against, right, this kind of professional, liberal, elitist class. That's more likely to be the axis of this polarization than a kind of outright racial polarization.
Right. So, you just spoke of this and you've written on this extensively before, but there's been, again, we've been seeing this for some time. This election will only perhaps raise more questions on this crisis of the liberal order. The post, yeah. It was New Labour in one sense, Clinton in the other, the Democrats went a certain way, which perhaps has led to this image of elitism. But I'd like to get your thoughts. Is this liberal order, the left liberal or just a liberal order crisis now deepening? Because you also saw, say, when you take people like Liz and Dick Cheney supporting Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. So you've seen these inversions as well. So how do you see that now in the future for this kind of liberal politics?
So look, I think the liberal order, frankly, died a long time ago. And there are two aspects, or let's say three aspects of its death, right, that need to be separated out. One aspect of the liberal order was globalization, right, which was a belief in open borders, open society, mostly mobility of capital, more mobility of capital than mobility of labor. But in principle, right, the direction of the liberal order was supposed to be that greater global integration, economic integration is on balance, in a sense, a good thing, right? And I think the crisis of that order was apparent after the 2009 financial crisis. I don't think we've, in a sense, recovered from that. The domestic legitimacy of that liberal project, I think, eroded a long time ago. Now, I actually happen to think that that liberal project was a salvageable project. I think the integration of the global economy on balance will still be a good thing, particularly for developing countries like India. But there is absolutely no question that we are turning back on globalization and replacing a view of global politics that was premised on a kind of non-zero-sum competition between countries to now a zero-sum game competition between countries. Now, if you're a little bit cynical about it, you can actually say that this backlash against globalization primarily came because countries in the West were actually now genuinely being challenged by countries in Asia. So they were happy to play this game so long as it benefited them. And the minute there's a prospect of actually substantive power shift, right, the shutters actually begin to kind of, go up. So that's one component, right, which is in a sense globalization, right? The second, in a sense, is liberal constitutionalism, right, which is, in a sense, this belief in the sanctity of the individual, greater and greater protection of individual rights, right? The expansion of the space for individual freedom, right? And I think there is a sense in a lot of circles that this project has kind of run out of steam. It has two major deficiencies. One, it's not a project that actually talks about collective identity and the collective good in some ways, right? It, in a sense, is too individualistic, particularly in relation to the kinds of demands that arise about what it actually means to create a collective national identity, right? I think the second worry about this project is a kind of old worry. It's an old philosophical worry that liberal project was very good about telling us what constraints on individual freedom we need to remove. It was actually not very good about telling us about how do we exercise our individual agency, to what ends, once those constraints have actually been removed. And what people see, right, as emerging as a result of that freedom is not something they like, right? They see, they see too much wokeism. They see, in a sense, too much kind of moral chaos. They see too much tolerance for crime. All those kinds of things, right? Right. So that's the kind of second, right? And the third aspect of the liberal order is, of course, the liberal international order, which, frankly, the U.S. never believed in and killed a long time ago. Which is to say that liberals have never held the moral high ground on executive authority and war. War has been a pretext for expanding executive authority over the last 30, 40 years, certainly since the war on terror, since 9/11, right? It is actually public discourse about war that has discredited the liberal claims to truth consistently, right? It's not a conversation you can, in a sense, have, frankly, and it's undermined the legitimacy of, in a sense, liberals. And whatever residual legitimacy that liberal international order had, basically now lies in the rubbles at Gaza, which is, if that order could tolerate this kind of war in the 21st century, right, and the double standards it produced, frankly, I think people would be wise not to believe in the claims of that liberal international order. So yes, all three components are now under deep stress.
Yeah. So on the third component, I'd just like to get a little more from you on this international order, because we also see, there is the rise of China, an undeniable fact. Trump has spoken of it, Biden has. And it is, in a sense, whether it's Belt and Road, whether it's saying, I will not lecture you on your morality when I'm doing business with you. Let's say with and now with already, like you're saying, it was eroding for a while now. Even institutions like the WTO have, even on globalization, places like the WTO, NATO is increasingly, Trump is the one questioning NATO. It's a Cold War alliance, much like Russia did, saying, why is this Cold War alliance at my doorstep now? In a sense, China backing these claims, and India is in a curious position now. We've sort of put our eggs in one sense in one basket, or tried to divide them up. But so India's role now in a Trump world where we may not do as badly as, or may not be as badly off as some others. But how do you see that now playing out with the so-called rules-based order rhetoric finding less and less resonance and in a Trump world now and his international sort of outlook?
So look, as you suggested, India is in an advantageous position in one sense, which is it is still the one major power absolutely everybody is willing to talk to and do business with. It's really quite a remarkable asset, and now the term is poo-fooed, but it is actually still the spirit of non-alignment in some senses, right? Which is, we exercise our own strategic autonomy, we do things in our own national interest, and the objective of the policy is that our relations with everybody should always be better than their relations with each other, right? And you actually leverage this ability, in some senses, to secure strategic space for yourself, right? To that extent, I think India is in an advantageous position, and I don't think that's, in a sense, going to change. And it can use a lot of sort of pieces on the chessboard. I don't quite buy the story that India has kind of put its eggs in one basket or the other. It is actually, I think, playing a much artful game. But the place where we do need to be worried, right, which is our core interest, has to be to create the maximum possible space for our own economic development, right? Um, and I think that's where I think we are on a slightly weaker wicket. We are slightly weaker wicket because you can create this space in part if your own domestic model of development and your domestic economy, your domestic institutions are actually, in a sense, a much stronger position, right? Now, that is where I think there's a large degree of uncertainty over where Trump will go, right? When he talks of reciprocal tariffs, what does that mean for India? Does that mean that a massive export promotion strategy is no longer a kind of option for India? And if it's no longer an option for India, how does India think of industrialization in the absence of growing domestic demand, right? So I think that's the core issue on which I think India is in a weaker position, mainly because it's domestically in a weaker position. We aren't clear in our kind of heads about what kind of economic model of development we want to pursue and how do we secure the international kind of space for it. The last and final thing I think on this point, I think the international order is, which is, so one of the things I think as we discussed last time with Trump is, honestly, the range of outcomes that might result from a Trump presidency for the international system are quite wide. I mean, we really just don't know. Trump is, for example, at least his stated doctrine is much more aggressive in the Middle East, including regime change in Iran, Lebanon, Syria, right? That could set off a chain of events that could deeply destabilize the world, in some senses, the world order. He wants to drive a wedge, I think, between Russia and China. In some senses, we don't know how that in a sense works out. So one of the things I think India will have to, navigate much more artfully is that the potential instability in the world order and shifting geopolitical alliances will require us to be much, much more nimble. But fundamentally, I think we have to go in this with a clear-eyed sense that we are on our own, and at the end of the day, we have to protect our own interests on our own feet.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. As always, it's a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we'll speak again soon. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate. We have taken back control of the Senate. Wow, that's...
US Election 2024, brought to you by Striker, Hexo.ai.